In my most recent video, I talked about why you should max out on unique cards and some of the roles they fill in deck building. I also reviewed some cool example uniques. This time, we'll be powering through a huge list of additional unique spoilers. These are all taken from photos from official events. Thanks to everyone who provided the photos and helped with the translations. Let me know in the comments which of these you'd love to have for your decks, and make sure to like and subscribe to support the channel. Up first are some unique Sakarabru. The first one is wild. For 3 extra mana, you get this 5/4/2 with a Banishing Gate effect. From hand, it seems almost unplayable because you won't be able to use it until turn 8, and the stats are so bad you'll most certainly lose both expeditions unless your opponent somehow committed all of their mana to a character on their first play. That being said, discarding a character or permanent is a play from anywhere effect. If you can find a way to get this in the reserve early with something like the Sneezer Shroom from the last video, you can play this for just 5 mana as an overpowered Dorothy that can even remove Brassbug Hive. This next one seems fine. It has slightly worse stats than the rare version, and there is an added discard cost to get the main effect, but the payoff is you get 3 boosts and can Sabotage at Dusk when played from the reserve, which could be pretty good value in the late game. Discarding one of your cards and one of theirs evens out, so you'll have to decide if you prefer playing the 5/5/5 for 4 from the reserve or a Shenlong, with 8 in stats for 6. With this one, once again we're seeing worse stats than the rare, but better than the common, and a cost for the main effect. Here the benefit is you eventually get 2 draws for discarding twice from the reserve. It kind of seems like Sakarabru and Amahe had a baby. This next one's probably my favorite. The stats aren't great, but you don't have a cost for the base effect, and the additional optional effect seems incredible. You can put a card from your hand in the reserve to discard a permanent, which could be super strong on curve, and like the first Sakarabru, if you can get this in the reserve with an effect, you can play it early, this time for the low cost of 3 mana. Hopefully we'll get some Izmir non-uniques that can put cards in the reserve for these kind of crazy combos. These next ones are Bravos. The first is a 2/4/5, and you'll have to decide if half a draw is worth the odd stats, but the reserve cost of 3 is definitely nice. The next one seems pretty darn good. The Dorothy effect makes up for the worst stats, but since this is Bravos, you won't always have the after you to guarantee that you'll go second, which could be awkward. Needing a landmark to get the base effect shouldn't be hard to meet that late in the game, and the discard from reserve effect is nice because once your opponent can see the Sakarabru there, they might play around you replaying it again. And this next one seems pretty great. It has the discard from reserve cost tied in with the effect, but the 3 boosts will make this a 5/6/8 for your treble, or 6/7/9 in Basira. The play from reserve effect is also cute with Basira, and the costing is great with Atsadi. In Atsadi, after you play a 6-drop twice and get 2 draws, you can follow it up with this, once from hand and once from the reserve for super cheap, getting you a 3rd and 4th draw with him. I think we'll see a disproportionate amount of unique Sakarabru in competitive play over the common and rare, because the card's pretty expensive, and I feel like without a little extra something, it'll be hard to justify. On the other hand, these Salvagers are super cheap, and it's interesting to see how they balance them for the unique form. This first one could help you get extra counters on Traced with the discard from reserve effect, and the slightly better stats and flipped cost make it like a slightly worse Amelia Earhart from the reserve. The main effect seems a little secondary. Unless we get a bunch of one-time use permanents that you're fine to get rid of, I don't really think this will be relevant that often. The next one has decent stats, but costs 2 from hand and reserve. Once again, it's hinging on the right permanent reveals for the first effect to be good. You could maybe sacrifice a used up hub, but the permanent pool is so small right now, it's hard to know how this will do. But with the second effect on top, if Sierra ever starts consistently playing 3-cost permanents every turn, this could definitely be a value house. This next one almost feels more like a spell to me. You have zeros across the board and a lot of effects that put cards in the reserve. You can give something fleeting, but that seems a little expensive for 1 mana and 2 cards. But if it is a permanent, then you can replay it immediately from the reserve to trigger the second effect, which is fine, but you'll have multiple cards in the reserve, especially with this going there at night, and a lot of mana spent, so it'll be a lot of work to not discard at the end of the day. This next one I like more. In Subhash and Sierra, it'll be much easier to meet the requirement compared with the previous versions. The stats are worse, but with the low hand cost, it's fine, and you can discard it from the reserve if you don't want to pay 2 to play it, and mess up your opponent with fleeting. For a net 1 cost, that all seems pretty good for a 1-drop, but maybe people will lean towards more expensive unique cards instead, where the value starts to compound a little more. Here we see a 1-drop from hand and reserve, which is a great start. The main effect is kind of difficult to pull off, and not that great again, but the discard from reserve effect is great. If Sierra players think a 4th mechanic is worth a unique slot, then this would be a perfect fit for them. Next is another card that can cosplay as Amelia from the reserve, and the play from reserve effect could definitely be reasonable at times. The fleeting option is cute too, but I would probably just run the common or rare over this unless I'm consistently putting it straight into the reserve or I always have a permanent to discard for it. And the only Bravos example seems pretty cracked. The stats and costing have become more aggressive at the cost of a conditional resupply, but in the right deck with Haven or Basira, the requirement will be no problem. This first Jeanne is basically the rare with an extra requirement, but I could see it being good that it costs 1 less from reserve, and having the option to discard it to create a token is flexible, especially in something like Golrong. The next one is surprisingly aggressive. In Sigismar with a carrier out, this will consistently be a 4-cost 5/3/5 over 2 bodies, and the double 4s for biomes will be great in the right regions. If you want to spend one more on this, you can still get a recruit at the end of your turn. It seems like you made a trade for better stats up front in exchange for a weaker payoff, but that could be a great deal in decks that want some residual value but can't afford the initial tempo loss of the original Jeanne. This first Axiom unique Jeanne is pretty interesting at only 3 costs from hand, but for the high requirement of 2 landmarks, you'll only get 1 bug, which averages out to the value of Foundry Armorer split between 2 turns. The buffs when you create a token seems a little unhelpful too, because most of this is done during the morning or evening, when this card won't be on the field to benefit, and the 4 reserve cost isn't helping much either. With the right reveals, this could be good if you can consistently get a bug and buff it, but with the current card pool, that seems unlikely. This next one has the same stats, cost, and first effect as the rare, but you also need to put a card from your hand in the reserve, so I doubt it'll see play. Getting boost when robots come out is essentially as hard as getting boost when tokens join your expedition, and with a cost of 5, it will be near impossible to pull off a combo like that. Sadly, since the effect to put a card from your hand in the reserve doesn't happen until this leaves the expedition, you won't be able to pull off a combo with Capellia to get a boost. And now it's time for Atlas. Atlas is another cool card that I think could use some unique sauce to see more play. All of them so far have Gigantic, and this one is essentially 4/6/4 for 4 from hand, which seems fine, and you can draw 3 cards when played from the reserve. That's a powerful effect, but it'll be hard to get this into the reserve and 2 permanents into play. If you can pull it off though, you'll definitely be rewarded, and if one of the permanents is the Ortis Bastion, your board presence will be pretty darn good too. This next one feels a little expensive for the stats, but if you consider that permanent removal usually costs 3, then the 2/2/3 giant for 3 that's paired with it, it's not bad. I think this card's a little situational though, and it'd be sad to have to put a unique in the mana in half your matchups, so I'm not sure that I'd run it. Next we have a 4/3/4 for 6, which is almost Shenlong value. That's already fine from hand, but when you get this in the reserve, it's really good the second time around at just 4 mana, and the extra effect to bank 1 mana as a token is just an extra bonus. This last one was very impressive to me at first, but I'm starting to think it's situational. With 4s across the board, it's really strong from hand, and you can basically turn a card from your hand into a 0 cost off you go as well. In Sigismar with Carrier, you're looking at removing a hand cost 3 as the minimum for the removal, but my biggest problem is that if you go first, you won't have a target for this, and even if you go second, as long as your opponent starts their turn with something small, you won't get much out of the removal either. Since this uses all or most of your mana on turn 6 and 7, you'll probably end up trading lanes most of the time because they'll just play to 1 expedition after this comes out. This is also weak to opposing removal, but if games get grindy and you're consistently hitting 8 or 9 mana with this in your Ortis deck, then it could be an absolute powerhouse. Now for the Bravos examples. This first one already has better stats than the common. In Basira, you could play this from the hand on 6 and then use a Blade Dancer from hand, or a 1-drop from the reserve if Haven's out, and then you can use that and Basira to buff both characters, ending with a really strong board and the opportunity to remove a permanent. If large permanents are king, this would definitely be worth slotting in. This next one has worse stats, and the first effects with boost is fine, but I don't think it's why you'd run the card. However, the extra ability to put this in the mana is impressive, and if you want more ramp, I could see people searching this out as a 4th Mighty Jeanne for their deck. I do think it'll be a little easier to get behind in expeditions when you play this relative to Mighty Jeanne, so you might not be able to afford to use it in some matchups. And for the third time, we have an Atlas with hand cost 5 and reserve cost 6. And this time, it has better stats again, but Mountain gets the extra biome point. This one has a pretty similar feel to the first Bravos Atlas, but you get draws instead of permanent removal. That seems a little weaker overall, but it's less situational and you can get multiple draws in a turn with the right hand. That'd be hard to do though since it has a high cost, but who knows, maybe you'd run both, even though I'm not quite as keen on this one. Alright, let's look at some Muna Druids. Every one of these has the standard discard from reserve to give anchored, so I won't talk about that much. I honestly think that for this first one, 4/1/2 might be good enough on its own to play this because it's more aggressive than the original and could be easier to get out in the late game. And this extra ability to gain a boost, it's just the cherry on top. In Tasia, you'll easily have 1 boosted anchored character at the start of each of your turns, and after you play this Druid and he gets boosted, he'll get an additional boost for every character you play. That might not happen until the late game, but that's when the current Muna Druid is the worst, so I'd like this a lot. Now we have one with slightly worse stats and a higher reserve cost. The trade-off is for 1 more mana, you can give something fleeting, anchored, or asleep. That's super cool and flexible. You can probably still play this early to get it in the reserve, and in the mid game, it can double as per body. Then in the late game, it can be a 4th beauty sleep. Everything's fairly costed, but with 4 options each time he's played, it's pretty exceptional. Next is a 4/2/2 for 4. This one's kind of similar to the first one, but it gives 2 boosts to something in your other expedition. I think this is worse because the higher cost makes this extra effect almost a requirement to be worth the mana instead of having it as a bonus. Not being able to use it on day 1 is a drawback, and it doesn't seem good enough to merit the planning it'll take to use this effect later. As for the Axiom Druids, this first one costing 2 mana is great. That'll easily fit into the curve, and the stat hit is totally merited. The optional Keylon Elemental effect is a bonus that could combo well with cards like Amelia, and giving fleeting when you put a permanent in the reserve is a strong bonus. And this next one doesn't even feel like a Muna Druid. The Muna 4-cost Druid seemed like a pain to play and make work, but this one gives itself 2 buffs with no drawback from hand. 5/6/5 is incredibly strong for 4 mana, and it gets rid of the normal drawback of having to make a low tempo play to get this card in the reserve. His 3-cost reserve version can cycle more cards for Trace and has strong stats again too, so playing him a second time may even compete with the discard from reserve effect. The next one is similar but has worse base stats and only gains a boost if you control a token and landmarks. This will basically always be weaker from hand, but the trade-off is it only costs 2 mana and gains a boost from the reserve as well. If everything lines up perfectly, it could be a 5/4/5 for 2. You definitely wouldn't run this in Traced, but it could be really good in Subhash where you could put it straight in the reserve and play it as a huge body with 1/2 Haven on the board. And lastly is another 2 cost from hand with the option to pay 1 to draw a card. Flexibility is never bad, and if you do pay 1, this is essentially common Baba Yaga with the same total stats in different regions. I don't think you pay a total of 4 from the reserve for a second draw, but that's not a problem since you have the discard from reserve effect. I'd love this in Muna because you could easily play it on day 1 and trade expeditions like you do with the common, but the free draw could help your resources throughout the game. In the right Axiom deck, I'm sure this could have a place too. Now let's look at some Bravos Tanuki. The cost of 2 with an extra 4 stat makes this great tempo from hand. It'll beat a lot of the current best 2-drops like Hathor on its own. The trade-off is you get the Sabotage effect the second time he's played, and you have to put a card from your hand in reserve to do so. I think the net benefits of the changes here definitely outweigh the costs. If you don't want to play him a second time, you can just discard him from the reserve to get an extra use out of one of your other cards instead, and if you replay him, there is the potential to combo with Haven or putting something else there like a rare Atlas. This next one keeps the same costing with the original stats. You don't have to put a card from your hand in the reserve now for the Sabotage, and you have the extra option to pay 1 when something gains a boost to remove fleeting from another character. The first example was more aggressive and might be a better fit for Kojo, and this one is more focused on value and fits well on Basira. But this next one is my favorite of the 3. We're back to the stronger stat line with no cost associated with the Sabotage effect as well. You do have to pay 1 more from the reserve, but you're getting the ability to discard a permanent if you control a landmark. I could easily see someone running all 3 of these in the same deck, but this one feels like especially good value and worthwhile against permanents of any size. I am worried though that cards like this could be a little bit troublesome for competitive gameplay. If both players need a permanent in play of their own to remove a permanent from their opponent, then whoever draws their removal first will not only now have a strong permanent while their opponent doesn't, but they'll also be immune to their opponent's removal if they draw the same card. This next one is the first with a water stat. It costs 3 from hand, but I assume you'll probably pay the 1 extra most of the time to get the 2 boosts and make it a 6/2/4 or 7/3/5 in Basira for 4. The discard from reserve effect to make something cost 1 less could also work well to do Atlas combos earlier. It's honestly surprising how much variation they can have on one card. This next one gets to Sabotage from hand and reserve. While all of these Tanuki have been good, this is the first one that's just blatantly better than the rare in all situations. Removing fleeting for 1 extra mana at dusk is a free bonus, and being able to give fleeting is a cute way to make sure that there's always a way for you to mess with your opponent even if their reserve is empty. And I thought I'd seen everything, but this next Tanuki surprised me. It draws a card and has really solid stats. It'd be great in a deck that cares more about improving card advantage than damaging your opponents. But Sabotage isn't completely gone, because you can still do it when this card is played from reserve if you put another card from your hand in the reserve. And the option to remove fleeting from one of your characters instead is great if you think playing them an extra time would be stronger than replaying this. And we have one more Tanuki, which is for Lyra this time. It has the original stats and costing, and has the effect to roll a die when played from anywhere, and if you get a 4 or more, Sabotage. The Lyra rare Tanuki has this effect when played from the reserve, and sabotages normally from hand, but to make up for the slight hit to consistency for the unique, this card also sabotages when it leaves the expedition. On average, this card will sabotage 3 times compared to 1.5 for the rare. This also seems great with Fen and Iraq, because you won't miss either effect when playing this from the reserve or the top of your deck, since nothing is tied to being played from hand. It's been a ton of fun looking at all these example unique cards. I can definitely see how they're trying to stay true to each of the cards. All of the Atlas have Gigantic, and each of these Tanuki have some kind of way to sabotage. With the Tanuki, it also seems like having a 0 stat was core to his identity, and for several, the stats and costing were identical to the rare and common. But for some of the other uniques we observed today, the stats and costing were all over the place. It'll be really interesting to see which styles they choose to move for the many characters of Altered as more and more unique cards are revealed. Are there any effects that you're hoping to see on a unique card which haven't been revealed yet? Let me know in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe. The support will help me bring more Altered content your way.